I never imagined I'd be standing in my own restaurant, sweat dripping down my back, hands shaking as I struggled to balance a tray of drinks while the kitchen exploded into chaos around me. The air was thick with the scent of garlic and seared steak, the rapid-fire orders from the chefs, the impatient chatter of customers waiting too long for their meals. Somewhere in the rush, a glass shattered. Someone cursed under their breath. My feet ached, my head pounded, and I had no idea how my staff did this every night. But let me back up. My name is Daniel Russo, and I own Russo's Kitchen, a family-run Italian restaurant chain that started with my parents nearly 40 years ago. I grew up in the business, but as the company expanded, my role shifted from hands-on operations to running things from a distance. I trusted my managers, believed in my staff, and assumed things were fine. Lately though, the cracks had started to show: higher employee turnover, slower service times, customer complaints. When I asked my managers about it, they brushed it off. "It's just the industry," they said. "Things are under control." I wasn't so sure. So I did what any stubborn CEO would do: I went undercover. A week ago, I hired myself as a waiter at one of our busiest locations under a fake name. With a scruffy beard, a thrift store uniform, and a made-up resume, I blended in. Most of our employees had never met me in person, just seen my name on emails or a framed photo on the office wall. No one recognized me. No one treated me like the boss. And within minutes of my first shift, I realized I had underestimated just how tough this job really was. The dinner rush was relentless. Orders piled up faster than the kitchen could handle. Servers darted between tables, balancing trays and refilling drinks while customers grew impatient. The hostess tried to keep the chaos at bay, but we were short-staffed, and it showed. The kitchen was a pressure cooker, both literally and figuratively. Marco, the head chef, was sharp, talented, but had no patience for mistakes. A single wrong order earned a glare, a muttered insult, a wave of frustration that sent tension rippling through the staff. No one had time to breathe, let alone recover from a mistake. Jess, one of the senior servers, was drowning. She handled more tables than anyone else, moving so fast she barely had time to take a breath. When a customer complained about their pasta being wrong, she apologized, rushed to fix it, and before she could turn around, Marco was on her case, snapping about delays. "Are you even paying attention, Jess?" he barked, barely glancing up from the line. She stiffened. "I'm trying," she said, her voice unsteady. "But I can't be everywhere at once." The kitchen fell silent. The only sounds were the sizzle of food on the grill and the distant clatter of dishes. No one spoke up. The manager stayed quiet. The other servers kept their heads down. I watched, waiting for someone to say something, to step in, but no one did. So I did. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, steadied my voice, and said, maybe she wouldn't be so behind if we weren't understaffed. Marco's eyes snapped to mine, his expression darkening. "Who the hell are you to tell me how to run my kitchen?" I met his glare, my heart pounding. Just a guy trying to do his job. Something shifted in the room, a flicker of unease running through the staff. Jess stared at me, surprised. Marco's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just a stressful night. It was a bigger problem, a deep-rooted issue with how we ran things. The question was, how had I let it get this bad without noticing? And more importantly, how was I going to fix it? For now, though, I had a more immediate problem: surviving my second shift. By my second shift, the exhaustion had settled deep in my bones. Every muscle ached, my lower back throbbed, and my feet felt like they had been through a war. But it wasn't just the physical strain that got to me, it was the sheer mental load. The constant pressure, the unspoken expectation that you had to be perfect while running on fumes, the way customers barely glanced up at you except to complain. And worst of all, the feeling that no one in charge seemed to care. I kept my head down and worked. I refilled drinks, cleaned tables, ran food from the kitchen. I forced smiles through customer complaints. I watched my co-workers push themselves past the breaking point. Jess, the senior waitress who had nearly collapsed under the stress last night, wasn't faring any better. She was moving even faster tonight, barely stopping for air, trying to make up for the lack of hands on the floor. She hadn't had a break in hours. No one had. Marco was in the kitchen barking orders as usual, his voice sharp, his patience non-existent. But the real problem, the one I hadn't fully noticed on my first night, was the general manager, Rob. Where was he? Nowhere to be found. Every time things got chaotic, Rob either disappeared into his office or stood near the bar chatting with a friend who had stopped by. When a group of customers flagged him down to complain about a missing order, he nodded vaguely, promised to look into it, and then left it for someone else to fix. The tension on the floor was growing. Jess wasn't the only one struggling. One of the newer waiters, Luis, had just dropped an entire tray of drinks, and instead of helping, Rob muttered, "For God's sake, Luis, be careful," before strolling off again. Luis bent down to clean the mess, his hands shaking. I crouched next to him, helping pick up the broken glass. "You good?" I asked quietly. Luis let out a breath. "I don't know, man. I'm just trying to keep up." I understood that feeling more than I cared to admit. An hour later, it happened. A customer at table 9, a middle-aged man in a pressed button-down, the kind of guy who thought he was more important than everyone else in the room, was growing impatient. He had been waiting longer than expected for his steak, and Jess, who was trying to keep 3 other tables from revolting, hadn't been able to check on him fast enough. When she finally made it to his table, he barely let her speak before snapping, "This is ridiculous. I've been waiting forever. Do you people even know how to run a restaurant?" Jess tried to de-escalate, apologizing and promising to check on his food, but he wasn't having it. "You know what? Forget it. Get me your manager." I saw the way Jess's shoulders slumped. Not because she didn't want to fix the situation, but because she already knew how this was going to go. Rob finally emerged from his hiding spot near the bar and approached the table with an exaggerated sigh, rubbing his temples like he had a million more important things to deal with. "What seems to be the problem?" The customer went off about the wait time, the service, the lack of professionalism, throwing in some unnecessary comments about people these days not knowing how to do their jobs. Rob listened with his arms crossed, nodding at all the right moments. Then, instead of defending his staff, instead of taking any kind of responsibility, he turned to Jess and said, "What happened?" Jess blinked, clearly thrown by the question. We're a little backed up in the kitchen, but I don't want excuses, Jess," Rob interrupted, his voice loud enough that the tables nearby went quiet. "This is unacceptable. We can't have customers waiting this long. If you had been paying closer attention, maybe this wouldn't have happened." Jess's face turned red, and I saw her hands grip the notepad at her side. She looked humiliated. And I saw it. The moment something inside her broke. She swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and did what I think she had been holding back for months. She untied her apron. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice shaking. Rob frowned. "Jess, don't be dramatic." "No." She looked him in the eye, standing taller than I had ever seen her. "I work doubles. I skip breaks. I bend over backward to keep this place running, and you treat me like I'm the problem? I'm done." The silence was deafening. Every employee on the floor had stopped what they were doing. The kitchen staff peered out from behind the counter. Even the customers seemed frozen, unsure of whether they should keep eating or pretend they weren't witnessing a complete workplace implosion. Jess dropped her apron on the nearest table and walked out. No one stopped her. And as I stood there, gripping the tray in my hands, my heart pounding, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a broken shift. This was a broken system. And I wasn't leaving until I fixed it. Jess walking out should have been the wake-up call. Instead, Rob just scoffed, shook his head and muttered, "Some people can't handle the pressure." Then he walked off, leaving the rest of us scrambling to cover her tables. I was furious. By now, I had seen enough. The kitchen was overwhelmed, the floor staff was running on fumes, and Rob, the person who was supposed to be leading, was either blaming or ignoring the problem altogether. I couldn't just stand by. When a family at table 12 flagged me down, I braced for another complaint. Instead, the father leaned forward and said, "Your waitress, the one who left, she was great. She didn't deserve that." That was it. The last straw. I pulled off my apron, walked straight into the back, and knocked on Rob's office door. He barely looked up from his phone when I stepped inside. "What now?" he muttered. I closed the door behind me. "We need to talk." Rob sighed, tossing his phone on the desk. "If this is about Jess, she'll cool off. She'll come back." "No," I said, my voice steady. "She won't." He scoffed. "You don't know that." "I do," I said. And you would too if you actually paid attention to what your team is going through. His expression darkened. Who do you think you are? I took a deep breath, then reached into my pocket, pulled out my wallet, and slid my business card across the desk. Rob's face paled as he read it. Then his eyes shot back up to mine. Wait, what? I folded my arms. I own this restaurant, Rob. And I've spent the last 2 nights watching you run it into the ground. He swallowed hard, but I wasn't finished. This place is broken, I said. And starting tomorrow, we're going to fix it. Rob's mouth opened, then closed. His usual arrogance flickered into something else, panic. Look, Daniel, he started, but I cut him off. Save it. I sat down across from him, leveling my gaze. You've spent more time avoiding problems than solving them. I watched you ignore complaints, let your staff drown, and then humiliate Jess in front of customers. That's not leadership. His jaw tightened. You don't understand how hard it is to. I do. I leaned forward. Because I've been in it for the past 2 nights. And I can tell you right now, this restaurant isn't failing because of the staff. It's failing because of how it's being run. Silence. He knew he couldn't argue. I exhaled. You're done, Rob. Effective immediately. His face turned red. You can't just. I can, I said, standing. And I will. I left him sitting there, stunned, and walked back onto the floor. The team was running on autopilot, just trying to make it through the shift. I stepped into the middle of the room and clapped my hands. Everyone, listen up. Tired faces turned toward me. Servers, cooks, dishwashers. My name is Daniel Russo. I own this place. A murmur ran through the staff. I let it settle. I've been working here undercover for the past 2 nights, and I've seen exactly what you go through. It's not okay. And it changes now. No one spoke, but I saw something shift in their eyes. A glimmer of hope. I looked toward the kitchen. Marco, you and I are having a talk after this shift. The way you handle stress in there, that needs to change. Marco wiped his hands on a towel, nodding stiffly. Then I turned to the team. We're short-staffed, overworked, and stretched thin. But that's not your fault. That's management's fault. And I promise you, things will be different. No one cheered. No one clapped. They were too tired, too beaten down to believe in words alone. And I didn't blame them. So I'd show them. Tomorrow, I wouldn't just be their boss. I'd be in the trenches with them. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was right where I needed to be. The next morning, I showed up early, dressed the same way I had been the past 2 nights. Plain uniform, no title, just another worker on the floor. But this time, everyone knew who I was. The staff was quiet, cautious. Some still looked skeptical. I didn't blame them. Words didn't mean much when you'd been ignored for so long. So I didn't waste time talking. I grabbed a mop and started cleaning the dining area before we opened. A few servers glanced at me, then at each other. When the first orders came in, I ran food. When the kitchen got overwhelmed, I helped plate dishes. I wasn't here to watch, I was here to work. It took a few hours, but slowly, the energy shifted. People started moving differently. Marco, usually tense and on edge, eased up just a little. Luis, the new waiter who had nearly cracked under pressure, worked more confidently. By mid-shift, I noticed something else. People were talking. Not just about orders or mistakes, but to each other. Jokes between the cooks, small conversations between servers. I pulled Marco aside between tickets. You're a great chef, I said. But this kitchen needs a leader, not a drill sergeant. He exhaled, nodding. I hear you. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was a start. At the end of the night, as the last customers left and the team cleaned up, I called everyone together. You all deserve better, I said. Better schedules, better support, better leadership. That's on me. But I need your help to fix it. For the first time, I saw something I hadn't seen before. They believed me. Tomorrow, the real changes would begin. The next morning, I made my first official change. I called an emergency staff meeting before we opened. No customers, no distractions, just us. Everyone gathered near the bar, some leaning against tables, others standing with arms crossed. They were tired, skeptical. After years of being ignored, I didn't expect them to trust me overnight. "I'm not going to stand up here and pretend I have all the answers," I started. "But here's what I do know, this restaurant doesn't run without you. And for too long, you've been doing everything you can with almost no support. That changes now." I scanned the room. Even Marco, usually cold and guarded, was listening. "The first thing we're fixing? The staffing issue," I continued. "I'm bringing in more help, starting with hiring 2 new servers and a busser by the end of the week." A ripple of surprise ran through the group. "The second change?" I went on. "No more skipping breaks. I don't care how busy we are, everyone gets time to breathe." Luis, the newer server, looked up. "But Rob always said we couldn't afford to slow down during rushes." "That's because Rob didn't know how to manage a restaurant," I said simply. "A burned-out team makes more mistakes. Mistakes slow things down. Taking care of you means taking care of the business." I paused, letting that sink in. "And lastly," I said, "I want your input. You all know this place better than I do. What's not working? What do we need to fix first?" There was silence at first, but then Jess, who had surprisingly come back after I called her the night before, spoke up. "We need better kitchen communication. Half the mistakes happen because orders get lost in the chaos." Marco nodded. "She's not wrong," he admitted. "We could use a better system for calling out orders." I nodded. "Good. We'll fix it." Then Luis raised a hand hesitantly. "Schedules," he said. "We never know when we're working until the last minute. It's impossible to plan anything." Another server, Erica, chimed in. "Yeah, and some people always get the worst shifts while others get the easy ones." I looked around. Several people were nodding. "Consider that handled," I promised. "From now on, schedules will be posted 2 weeks in advance, and we'll rotate shifts fairly." For the first time, I saw something shift in the room, actual hope. We weren't just talking about changes. We were making them. When the meeting ended, the team moved with a different kind of energy. It wasn't perfect, but it felt lighter. More focused. Later that night, after the dinner rush, Jess caught me by the counter. "I didn't think you were serious when you called me," she admitted. "Figured this was just another we hear you speech with no follow-through." I smiled. "That's fair." She studied me for a second. "But maybe you actually mean it." "I do," I said. "And I need people like you to help me make sure it sticks." She considered that, then nodded. "All right, boss. Let's see if you can actually pull this off." I grinned. Challenge accepted. We still had a long road ahead. But for the first time, I knew we were headed in the right direction. The next few weeks were the hardest and most rewarding of my entire career. Making promises in a meeting was one thing, delivering on them was another. I knew I couldn't just throw out big ideas and expect things to change overnight. Real leadership wasn't about speeches. It was about action. And action meant rolling up my sleeves and proving I was serious. I worked the floor every night, side by side with my team. I helped wash dishes when the kitchen got slammed. I ran food when the servers were behind. I took out the trash when no one else had time. Little by little, the team started to believe that I wasn't just another out-of-touch owner making empty promises. We hired the extra staff I had promised, a few new servers, a busser, and even a part-time hostess to help manage the rush. It made an immediate difference. The dinner service was still intense, but people weren't drowning anymore. Jess, who had hesitantly agreed to come back, actually smiled during a shift for the first time in weeks. The schedule issue was next. I made sure shifts were posted 2 weeks in advance, giving people time to plan their lives instead of scrambling at the last minute. I also made sure the best shifts weren't always given to the same people. Everyone got a fair rotation. Marco, the head chef, was a tougher challenge. He was still sharp and demanding, but after a long talk, he admitted he had been running on stress and frustration for too long. "I don't mean to be an ass," he muttered one night, rubbing the back of his neck. When things go wrong in the kitchen, I feel like it's all on me." "I get that," I told him. "But leadership isn't about yelling when things go wrong. It's about setting people up to succeed before they do." He nodded, thinking it over. And while he didn't become warm and fuzzy overnight, I noticed a change. He started communicating better, pulling people aside for corrections instead of calling them out in front of the whole kitchen. The team still respected him, but now they weren't afraid of him. For the first time in a long time, the restaurant started to feel like a team again. Of course, not everyone believed the changes would last. Erica, one of our longest-serving waitresses, pulled me aside after a shift one night. "You're here now," she said. "But what happens when you leave? When you go back to your office, and we're stuck with another manager who doesn't care?" It was a fair question. "That's why I'm not leaving," I told her. "Not yet. Not until I know the right people are in place to keep this going." The next morning, I met with my leadership team. With Rob gone, we needed a new general manager. But I wasn't about to hire another outsider who didn't understand what this place needed. Instead, I promoted from within. I called Jess into the office. She looked suspicious. "Am I in trouble?" I laughed. "No. You're getting promoted." Her eyes widened. "Wait, what?" "You know this place better than anyone. You care about the people here. And I need someone I trust running things when I'm not around," I said. "How about it?" Jess looked completely stunned, then shook her head. I don't know if I can do that." "You already have," I told her. "You've been leading this place for years, just without the title." She hesitated, then finally cracked a small smile. "If this is your way of making sure I don't quit again, it's a pretty good strategy." I grinned. "So, is that a yes?" She took a deep breath. "Yeah, it's a yes." 2 months after my undercover experiment, I worked my last shift as Danny Ross. I wasn't needed on the floor anymore, not like before. The restaurant had transformed. The energy was different. People weren't just surviving the shifts, they were actually enjoying them. The kitchen ran smoother. The front-of-house staff communicated better. Customers noticed the change, too. Positive reviews started rolling in again. As I finished my shift that night, I leaned against the bar, watching the restaurant I had nearly lost. Jess, now wearing a manager's name tag, was going over the schedule with Luis. Marco was laughing, actually laughing, with one of the line cooks. I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was Erica. "You proved me wrong," she admitted with a smirk. "Glad to hear it," I said. She crossed her arms. "So what now? You finally going back to your office?" I glanced around at my team, at my restaurant, at the place I had thought I knew until I had actually stepped inside it. "Yeah," I said, "but I won't stay there for long." Because real leadership doesn't happen from behind a desk. It happens right here in the trenches, where the real work gets done. And I wasn't about to forget that again. Looking back, I realized how easy it is to lose sight of the people who keep a business running. When you're at the top, it's tempting to think you understand everything based on reports and meetings. But numbers don't show you exhaustion. Spreadsheets don't capture frustration. And no email will ever tell you what it feels like to be drowning in a shift with no backup. I learned the hard way that leadership isn't about making decisions from a distance. It's about being there, seeing the struggles firsthand, and doing something about it. So if you're a leader, whether you run a restaurant, a company, or a small team, ask yourself this. When was the last time you actually stepped into your employees' shoes? You might be surprised at what you find.